as had generally happened in the scientific revolution and sometimes in the Enlightenment too. But as time wore on, many advocates of evolutionary theory, especially themselves, became quite hostile to Christianity. And they began to promote the language of a war between science and religion. Many people today mistakenly believe that it was conservative Christians who began using that language of a war as a way to protect themselves from dangerous ideas. But the language actually began as skeptical academics and others began to argue that science and religion had always been in conflict with one another. Well, any historian of science can tell you this was not true. But nevertheless, as the country entered the 20th century and the new learning began to permeate society, many conservative church leaders took their cue from skeptical scientists and began to argue to their congregations that, in fact, science and the new theology was directly attacking the fundamental tenets of Christianity. Evolution theories began to undermine the creation accounts of Genesis and suggest that the natural forces supervise the creation of all life, including human life. The church was very conflicted early on about how to respond to evolution and Darwin's theories about evolution, with a number of conservative theologians initially believing that evolution and the scriptures were compatible. But soon the battle lines were drawn over the issue between liberals and conservatives. Higher criticism of the Bible began to treat the scriptures rather roughly as a piece of literature and historical documents, which were not necessarily as reliable as traditionally thought. This line of thinking was obviously threatening to evangelical Protestants who held that without a reliable Bible, there could be no Christianity. By the 1890s, ministers and theologians such as the Congregationalist pastor Washington Gladden were willing to speak in shocking terms about the problems in the Bible. Gladden wrote in 1894 that, quote, "The Bible is not an infallible book. Human ignorance and error have been suffered to mingle with this stream of living water throughout all its course. The book is not infallible historically. It is a veracious record. We may depend upon the truthfulness of the outline which it gives us of the history of the Jewish people. But the discrepancies and contradictions which appear here and there upon its pages show that its writers were not miraculously protected from mistakes in dates and numbers and the order of events. It is not infallible scientifically," Gladden said. "It is idle to try to force the narrative of Genesis into an exact correspondence with geological science. It is not infallible morally," Gladden said. "By this I mean that portions of this revelation involve an imperfect morality. Any man who accepts the Bible as a code of moral rules, all of which are equally binding, will be led into the gravest errors." To your average Christian pastor or layperson, such statements were disconcerting and maybe offensive, as Protestants in particular had always assumed that the Bible was their singular guide to faith. On a related theme, advocates of historical theology began to teach that the basic tenets of Judaism and Christianity, like other religions, developed in a specific historical context, which may have influenced their development as much or more than the inspiration of God. Traditional Christians had always been aware that their faith developed in a historical context, of course, but to elevate context over the inspiration of God as the key to the religion's development was obviously troubling, because it seemed to make Christianity look man-made and unexceptional in the history of religions. To conservative Christians, the implications of the new thought were frightening and almost inevitably provoked a strong reaction. The response to the new theology came strongly from both Southern and Northern churches. In the South, by then perhaps the most solid bastion of conservative traditional Christianity, The most common reaction eventually became suspicion and rejection of the new theology.